Hello everyone, another update from me. Starting off with, well, I'll first mention no word from Richard D. Hall regarding the court case. As far as I know, he's expecting this judgment, but we have no idea which way this is going to go. He has no idea which way this is going to go. So keep an eye on his website, and maybe we'll hear something in the next few days as to what happens. Um, and then moving on, we've recently passed another anniversary of 9/11, the 23rd anniversary, and I was invited onto this show again, which is quite popular. You can watch this on Rumble, and it's the Stu Peters show. And actually, I knew that Ken O'Keefe was going to be on. He's on the left here. I've had some dealings with him in the past. It was actually over 10 years ago now, though, when I gave Ken a copy of Where Did the Towers Go when we were shared a train ride together. I've written that whole thing up in an article in 9/11 Holding the Truth, so you can go and read about that. The summary really is I don't think Ken is totally trustworthy, and neither does Max Igan. If you go back to 2014, you can read all about that, and also Ken O'Keefe's involvement with David Icke's failed thing called the People's Voice internet TV station. So the Stu Peters broadcast, it was a bit, I was a bit uncomfortable. They wanted to just bash Israel and the Jews, and although I know they're involved and Zionism is a very big problem, and Israel is obviously seems to be run by psychos. There seems to be a high concentration of psychos, and Israel seems to control a large swathe of American politics. Yes, I'm familiar with all of that, and we did a broadcast in Richard D. Hall's series as well on the Greg Felton book. So you can read that, and you can look at that video that Richard and I did a few years ago now on richplanet.net. So I wasn't very comfortable with this thing. There was quite a lot of disinformation in this broadcast. In this particular video, which I'll link, I think I came on about an hour and a bit into it. There was some problems with the sound as well. The audio wasn't going through properly.
Those buildings.
So
Thanks
that
to
created a
those
few
that
issues.
organised this.
So anyway, you can go and watch that if you want to. I wasn't particularly comfortable in that broadcast, and like I say, it didn't really focus on the core evidence that I wanted to talk about. But there we are. At least some of it got some exposure, I suppose. It's not something I would probably like to repeat, but it was all right. And a bit more comfortable for me was the broadcast or the podcast with Dr. Ahmed Malik, who contacted me following some postings by Norman, who's 9/11 revisionist. He'd posted on various Twitter accounts and stuff, and what this culminated in was me driving down to High Wycombe, and I did this podcast with Dr. Ahmad, who's a really good guy, and he spoke out in COVID. He has a whole story. You can read all about that on his website. Most of the podcasts from his website, I think if you click on this link here, you will find that most of them are health related. Most of these folks are sort of alternative health, or some of them are former GPs and stuff. You might see one or two familiar names. I was only familiar with one or two. James Dellingpole he did a podcast with, so you can get a lot of those for free. Some of them are in a subscriber base, but he does try to earn his living from this now, having left the medical profession pretty much in disgust. So that's the Rumble video. There's the link to that. That worked out very well, and as a result of that, I think we had a very strongly renewed interest in Where Did the Towers Go. So that combined with, for example, this video which a chap in France sent me. This is all in French, and he's going through the Where Did the Towers Go evidence with I think another French podcaster or broadcaster. I don't know the names. My French is okay. It's very basic really, but so yeah. You can, any French-speaking people that you know, you can send them this. We've had one or two videos like this now, several by I think the same guy, although he's used a different name. And I've had a few books have gone to France now. I've sent probably about 9 or 10 to France over the last sort of 4 or 5 months, so that's good. And you can see a lot of these pictures come from Dr. Wood's book, but that's okay. So the French are waking up to this now, as in proportion. So that's also a good development. So there's been more interest in the Where Did the Towers Go book this year on the 23rd anniversary than there was last year, I think, for me, from my end of it anyway. So yeah. And then moving on to something that might be related in some way. We've had another video which has come out with Ashton Forbes and Greg Reese, who does this Redacted News, I think it is. He's a former Fox presenter, and this was actually a very interesting interview. I've posted, I know, a couple of things about MH370 in the past, and I've sort of gone backwards and forwards with this. I thought that this video was real, the ones with the orbs. I think it's probably, you can see a bit of it here. He does go through these videos again here, and I'll try and mute the sound and just sort of play this to remind you while we're just talking here. And very interesting because he does make various points which seem to debunk the debunkers. I'm not entirely sure, but as I said to somebody, it's possible that the videos could be fake, but the story could be real. We don't know that for sure. One of the interesting things that Ashton Tate brought out in this interview was that there was
of free space
around
itself.
the time that this was all going on in 2014. This video appeared in 2014, I think a few weeks after this flight disappeared, and Forbes argues that it was a military whistleblower, and then he found the case of this Commander Edward Lynn, who seemed to have just the right sort of situation to have leaked this video, and I think he was court-martialed, or he was certainly prosecuted for leaking information, but they didn't say what that information was. So he did some digging on that. So I was quite impressed that he managed to find that. He's a very good researcher, I think, very thorough researcher. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it's another intelligence operation, maybe it's some type of disclosure, through the DIA or something. I'm not sure, but it's worth watching this video because there's quite a few things that came up in this video which I wasn't aware of. And in related to that, I can't remember how I think this was linked in the video that I've just described as something. There's a very thorough blog, and again, there's quite a lot of data here which I wasn't aware of, and it goes into the Ashton Forbes material quite thoroughly, and it talks about the plane possibly being taken to Diego Garcia, that came up years and years ago, quite soon after the events happened. So it's all quite interesting, so you can have a read of that if you want as well. The links will be in the description. So that was definitely, I didn't read through all of this because as you can see it's pretty long, but there's definitely some interesting data in there which I didn't know about. Even having watched the Netflix documentary and stuff, which that's all very interesting. And then another thing which I mentioned before, moving on again to a different topic, was the Göbekli Tepe, in the sort of control of that site by people who were aligned with the World Economic Forum. And again, for those that have not seen this, some people claim that this is a satanic group as well. You've got the 666 formed by this sort of arc going through the zeros, or the O's rather, of the words. Quite interesting, really. But Jimmy Corsetti, who's done all of this research, one of the lead archaeology people or heritage people in Turkey has now suggested that Jimmy Corsetti should be banned from entering Turkey, should be sanctioned for making these ridiculous videos. So that pretty much indicates that, they don't really want this to be known, what he's revealing. And I think, they have taken control of this because, again, I think ultimately we're talking about revelations that they don't want revealed. For example, when you look at the way sites like this were constructed, I've covered these Versodoco videos before about how the ancients might have used some sort of form of advanced knowledge or technology to soften the rock and make it do things that you wouldn't normally expect it to do. And I think probably it's something like that which they want to keep covered up ultimately, because it's all about us, transcending the physical world of matter in some way. So yeah, I think that's got something to do with it. And then again, changing topics again, I found this came up in my YouTube feed. The YouTube's quite good at feeding me things. Not only this stuff, but just like it seems I think the algorithms are okay for me. They work quite well for me. I'm not sure about you folks, but what this video was about was News Nation, Ross Coulthard. I mean, he's a bit of Let Me Sit Hangout, but he's done some interesting interviews, and he's interviewed people like Luis Elizondo, who is probably a bit of a storyteller, a bit of a, riding on the bandwagon of all this. I don't think Luis Elizondo is a totally honest person. Richard's done that analysis on him, and Coulthard sort of entertains the guy. I wouldn't. But anyway, so this lady, who's Dr. Beatriz Villarroel, what she did was, and what the interview is about, it's about an hour long. It's probably could be done a bit more succinctly, but it's okay. Pre-human orbital objects from 1950. So what this lady cleverly did is she went back into the archives of the Mount Palomar Observatory in the US. They've got a big telescope there, and they had all these plates from the 1950s, which have now been scanned in high resolution. And so she went through these and found several instances of where, if you take one plate, say like this one on the left, and then you have another plate taken half an hour later, then they have found what they call transients. So these objects appear in one plate but not the other. So she goes through the normal explanations. Now this lady, Dr. Beatriz, she has a PhD in physics or astronomy, or I think she's done like a master's in astronomy or something, and a degree in physics, or the other way around. So she's a smart lady, and she went through all these archives and they found these transients. So again, they found objects which appear on one plate but not the other, taken half an hour later. So, and they can't really be meteors. They kind of rule that out with various methods. And so it looks like she's found evidence of either satellites or UFOs in orbit, or at least flying very high in the sky in the 1950s, pre-Sputnik, when we didn't have any satellites. And there was a paper published in Nature regarding these objects. And there's quite a story behind this as well that she describes to Ross Coulthard in that interview. It's quite interesting. And she's been sanctioned as well for putting this stuff out. But it's pretty scientifically quite straightforward and quite solid. And these examples here, you can see that we've got these transients on the left, marked on the left, and they're not here on the right. And one of the dates that she found that these pictures were taken was 1952. I forget the exact date in 1952, but it coincided precisely with the sightings of flying saucers or UFOs or whatever you want to call them over the Capitol building in Washington DC, a very famous UFO flap. So one of the dates where these transients were captured at Mount Palomar coincided exactly with that date. But I think this Mount Palomar, anyone free to correct me if I'm wrong, is on the west coast of the US somewhere, or on the west side of the US, and of course Washington DC is on the right. So anyway, that's quite an interesting little paper, but somewhat inconsequential, compared to some of the other stuff that I've talked about in the past, and some of the stuff I've put in the book, the acknowledged book. But it's quite an interesting study, and rare that you get a scientist of her caliber coming out with this sort of data, really. So I did correspond briefly with her, and she was kind enough to reply to me, so that's always a good sign. She had a very friendly response. I sent her a link to my solar system book, and I thanked her for putting this information out and stuff, so that was okay. Again, so moving on to the next topic then, which is very much the other end of the scale, really, you might say. I recently went through this book on my ebook reader, Thanks for the Memories, The Truth Has Set Me Free, by Bryce Taylor, which is a pseudonym. And as you can see here, it says The Memoirs of Bob Hope's and Henry Kissinger's Mind-Controlled Slave. And I made some notes about this for the things that I wanted to just put in this video. But before I say that, this is a very harrowing read. There's quite a lot of explicit material in this book, which I was quite surprised was in there, just because of how explicit it is. Basically sexual references, descriptions of sexual acts, and so forth. So if you do read this, be warned. It's pretty graphic. There's quite a lot of graphic material in here. Even though I knew about this book, I've known about it for a long time. It was published in 1999. I've never actually read it until recently. But the story goes that Bryce Taylor, the author, whose real name is Susan Ford, she says she was a mind-controlled sex slave, and this was started at an early age. I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years old, and she describes this in horrible detail in the book because of the terrible abuse that her father, perpetrated on her as a child, and she was kind of sold into this sex slavery ring, or whatever you want to call it. Her mother wasn't really involved. She was kind of ashamed of it all, but felt she was unable to do anything about it. She describes how I think her brother was an abuser and abused by her father. And then I think sort of by the time she was like 12 or 13 or something, she was essentially owned by Bob Hope, and she goes into a lot of detail about this. Now, Bob Hope was a stand-up comedian, and it's true he was very close to many of the presidents up until his death in the I think the late in the mid 90s. I forget exactly when he died, but he knew all the presidents from I think from Truman to Clinton, I think, right the way through. So he was a very well-connected and influential person, even though he was an entertainer. So that much is true, and you can find other videos, nothing to do with Bryce Taylor or Susan Ford, which confirm that. But Bryce Taylor says she was programmed to get close to world leaders, especially the US presidents, and be intimate with them. And again, she goes into a lot of graphic detail in the book. And this happened even when she was like, 12, 13, 14 or whatever. And, she describes various scenes where she was involved, and some people were very uncomfortable that she was there with this President Kennedy or Reagan or whoever. And she describes quite a lot of detail how Nancy Reagan was very cruel to her and stuff. And you think, well, she's just making this up. Well, I don't think you can automatically assume that. She says she was controlled by Henry Kissinger, and he's described a lot and it tallies for me. There's nothing really that I can argue with in like what Kissinger was like. Very analytical. He had a lot of information, but she says that she was like a robot and she was like a human computer, and she could literally read through documents at high speed and memorize them all perfectly, and then summarize them, and Kissinger could extract information, and he'd use this for his meetings, and people couldn't understand how he knew so much. And then she was also used, to pass messages between people. She would give presidents messages from this supposed council. In her book, in the Thanks for the Memories book, she talks about the council and how they reminded me of the Committee of 300 that Dr. John Cole talks about. And I'll read some passages about this from the book later. And so she was right in the middle. She was like a robot that passed messages, recorded information. Interestingly, when I was reading the book, she talks about Maui a lot. She mentions Maui 22 times in the book, which is kind of interesting. And you tend to wonder if this is one of these sort of out of the way places where a lot of these dodgy things are going on, without our knowledge. But she mentions being with all the presidents from Kennedy to Clinton, all of them. She talks that she met with Prince Charles, according to her claims. She met with Prince Philip. She was abused by Ted Kennedy heavily. She had nights with Elvis Presley for a time. And you think, well, she's been with all these famous people. She must be making it up. She can't have been with all these people. That's just ridiculous. So that's kind of one reaction that you might have, and that's fair enough. She was programmed through the use of trauma and abuse, and which she describes how she had multiple personalities that could do different things. She switched between these personalities to perform certain roles, many of which were to do with sex slaves, and she was programmed to, suit each figure's preferences, and so on. And then she eventually had her own child called Kelly, and she describes how this child was taken and abused. Horrible stuff. She also mentions Cathy O'Brien and Mark Phillips, and I'll read out the passage on that at the end. Now, if you're not familiar with them, then you might want to read Transformation of America, where the trance is, like the hypnotized trance. That's available as a PDF. But I've read that a good few years ago now. Again, pretty harrowing read. Not quite as harrowing as this in my memory, but pretty harrowing read. And they tell a similar story. And then Susan Ford says that she was saved by Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and she's got many biblical quotations in there. And at the end of the book, she forgives her father. So yeah, it's all pretty harrowing stuff. But it's kind of got a sort of nice ending, and in that way that she did get out of it, and she was able to deprogram herself, apparently. So again, make of it what you will. But what interested me was some of the things that she said. There's quite a lot of text here, but I'm going to try and read it all out. So apologies for the length of this video. You can always skip through it if you're fed up of listening to me. Page 34 of this book, she says, what most of you are not being allowed to know is that years ago, at the outset of the Cold War, if not before, permission was given to a hidden group of so-called professionals and leaders to experiment on the unsuspecting American populace in an effort to further a variety of advanced technology. And that's one thing that stood out to me. Now, she talks a lot about technology. She doesn't go into specifics really, but she understands that technology is what they're using to control people. She doesn't use that phrase as I've just used it, but that's essentially what she says. And I don't remember that being in the Cathy O'Brien book so much. The technology gleaned by the American leaders, medical professionals and scientists was and still is in the form of genetic engineering, mind control, brain research, and this one is, get this, near-death experimentation, paranormal psychic experimentation, remote viewing, time and space travel, bioelectromagnetic frequency medicine, and other advanced projects, other advanced research that make our level of technological understanding and application antiquated. I am not suggesting that the technology was not in certain projects valuable. However, I am stating that it was often attained by the American government at the expense of American lives, as many of its citizens were experimented on without their knowledge or consent. So, yeah, I mean that's what's happened. That's an accurate summation. And this book was published in 1999, if I didn't already say that. Then she talks quite a bit about the World Health Organization. This really stood out to me, particularly as I say it was written 25 years ago. The World Health Organization was a cover for bringing together an inside group of people whose purpose and intent was much different than what was generally thought and publicly portrayed. Lots of illegal activity went on without detection and across borders internationally, as this inside group hid its covert operations under masked projects purportedly for world advancement. Among other things, it was also a cover for drug deals, child prostitution, heinous experiments on human beings, illegal sales of babies, etc. Some of the players I saw participating were a select group of politicians, celebrities and leaders worldwide. So that, again, there's that thread that runs through the whole book. I sat in on many meetings. I heard Ted Kennedy speak as well as Henry Kissinger, and there was a group of women who worked for the WHO that did not seem to have a clue about what was actually going on behind the scenes. Many were naive, honest, pliable people and actually played into the hands of the corrupt inner group without being aware that they were being used. And again, we've seen this happening, and so we know that this is now really what an accurate description this is. Masked behind the publicised do-good activities were illegal ventures intended to fund this corrupt group with their secret hidden motives and agendas. And again, we've seen that now. So while the United States appeared to be having benevolent beliefs and actions, these activities were put into motion. They sent a group to aid children in foreign countries, but behind the scenes, what was actually taking place was a mass drug connection or some other illegal enterprise that brought top dollar to this group of self-selected men who seek to eventually control the world. So again, this is like 20 years before COVID. Some meetings of the WHO were televised, but the agenda the public saw and heard was not the complete agenda that was secretly carried out. Again, I don't need to say any more about that. At another meeting, Mr. Speaker, I heard, Mr. Speaker, I would like to address the subject of the arms control race, Baker said. Then he spoke about his concerns about Russia escalating the arms race. What does that remind you of? That they were gaining speed and technology at such a pace that we, the United States, would be in serious jeopardy, at a disadvantage if we didn't set up immediate appropriations for arms research and arms production. Baker appealed to the United States' fear of being taken over in order to get money appropriated for arms, when in fact much of the funding was not used for what it was designated for, but instead was used in hidden, covert activities for the benefit of the Council and those politicians that were supported by the Council. And then she talks about how in her early years she was being heavily accessed and programmed by the Council for the use with influential men and women in positions of power. My use within government circles was guaranteed to be security proof due to the mind control I was under. They felt my programming kept the information I carried from my own awareness and from access by others who did not know the keys and codes to my system. Now, she doesn't describe exactly but she talks about keywords in songs and in nursery rhymes and this sort of thing and TV programs. And this has come up a few times in different areas. But she doesn't go into massive amounts of detail, but she gives you snippets here and there. I think maybe she didn't know fully how it all worked. But what those in government did not seem to know was that the council also had the ability to access me. They were secretly slipping in their own psychologically tested and carefully researched messages for me to deliver to presidents, of course, while she was being intimate with them, governors, senators, foreign leaders, entertainers, and many other people who were in positions of power or public influence. The council studied people's profiles and knew exactly what their likes and dislikes were, their sexual preferences, and any other information that could be used to influence people in ways the person was never even aware of. The council pre-programmed me with instructions all based on careful prior research of the targeted person, what to wear, how to act, what type of sexual stance to take, specific words or phrases to say, and the best time to deliver them. The council always worked up a complete strategy and never sent me to a targeted person unprepared. In these ways, this is the interesting bit, they influenced government leaders to act in their own favour or to pass or veto laws or bills that benefited their corporate holdings, to bring into office those people who could use as pawns to influence judges, government agencies, and enlist the large sums of monies and to control people in all walks of life. So this really, to me, is like the technology, in quotes, that they used to implement COVID. This is how they did it, because they need to control all these people to do something like COVID and not, for no one to be prosecuted by what's happened or after what's happened, which, very few people have been prosecuted for the COVID crimes or the 9/11 crimes because of what she says here, I would argue. My experience was that the council was publicly nameless, unknown, and this anonymity is what made it possible for them to wield power over the masses. From my perspective, these individuals acting in the shadows actually dictated in a subversive, inconspicuous manner the direction that our government took at the time. They were connected to powerful people like Bob Hope through me as their secret liaison, though I was programmed not to be aware of it. They felt they had their identities and security locked up tight. So, and I think, maybe my thoughts now about this Mark Phillips and Cathy O'Brien, they're limited hangout. They were limited hangout. They told you about some of what Bryce Taylor says, but not all of it. And this seems to be borne out in what she says about them, which I was kind of a little bit surprised to see. And this is on page 283 of the book. Several weeks later, with nearly 10 years of recovery behind me, the so-called retired CIA operative Mark Phillips was meant to have rescued Cathy O'Brien and looked after her and helped her deprogram, and he was apparently going to do the same for Bryce Taylor. The CIA operative made drastic changes in his living arrangements just to help me deprogram. After relocating across the country to a home in Arab, Alabama, where I paid all domestic expenses for the three of us, a large sum of money for travelling expenses for both he and his girlfriend Cathy and myself, and a large consulting fee, this renegade CIA operative read my lengthy journal entries daily for a year and a half and agreed that, in his own words, the memory work contains absolute elements of facts laced with verifiable details. But one and a half years later, 42 journals and $50,000 plus travelling and living expenses later, Mark Phillips informed me that nothing had ever happened to me, nothing whatsoever, and she had an overactive imagination. So I don't know what to make of all of that, but it does make you wonder, whether they're sort of trying to disclose stuff and then going back on that disclosure, in the next sort of book that comes out almost, So I don't know, but there's what I've read out. You'll see, I think, seems pretty accurately how things have unfolded since 1999, or as an overview. So talking about perhaps influencing public leaders and stuff. Somebody sent me this interview. I forget who it was, and you can have a listen to this. I was kind of a bit reluctant to this because it's like resurrecting the Q narrative, and I kind of felt, well, isn't that all done with? Didn't we find that all this talk of Trump, leading a secret military takeover? Well, all the bad guys are still doing bad stuff, and they seem to be getting worse. So whatever Trump was doing, if he was doing it, wasn't very effective. But nevertheless, Some interesting points are made in this interview. This chap Mike King has an interesting article which I've got here called "The Two Faces of Donald Trump," and he kind of explains how Trump seems to sort of do one thing one minute and one thing the next. And this is, he explains this in his article quite well. I found it quite interesting, quite persuasive. And sometimes I'm not sure what to think about this, but maybe Trump is just another player to kind of put people off the scent. And indeed, if you watch Chris Hampton's film, The Purge, this that he made about Trump, it does seem like Trump's just another player stringing people along, whether it's the Q narrative or just this MAGA, thing. But then Mike King makes this argument that Trump is actually acting president of the USA, but not publicly. And there was a whole talk in 2020 of how Kamala put her hand not on the Bible, but on a book that was in between the Bible and her hand, and that she wasn't VP and stuff. You can read all of that from back then. I'm not sure what to think about this, but have a look at all the evidence and see what you think. One thing, I've just been in touch with somebody and they talked about the path of the recent Hurricane Helene, HH, when if you take out the little horizontal bars of HH, what are you left with? She didn't say that, but she talked about the path of the hurricane going through mainly Trump or Republican sympathetic areas, and like Atlanta, which is Democrat, has been the hurricane went around that, and it's also, I think, the only hurricane in history which has actually increased in strength going over land. They're meant to draw their energy from warm water currents, according to the standard theory of how they operate, but this one didn't seem to be doing that. So you can look at the maps and stuff, and there's some terrible, terrible devastation in North Carolina and other places. So that's pretty awful again. It's a bit like Katrina, I suppose. That was terribly devastating. So yeah, it's all very sad. So you can have a look at that Purge documentary. Switching tracks once more. This is turning into quite a long video, but this is the last topic. I got this from Bob Greenyer, who runs the Martin Fleischer Memorial Project, and he did this little posting about crop circles and tying the way that crop circles form and the sorts of things that are seen in crop circles, orbs of light and exploded stems and strange patterns. He thinks this is all to do with these charge clusters and some of the effects that he's been documenting, and he makes this goes through this video is about 4 hours long. I do wish he'd shorten them down, but it's just the style he does them in. And he makes some very interesting points, some of which I covered in my Acknowledge book, the second part on crop circles, some of which is new to his research, and he talks about how plasma is involved and stuff like that. Quite interesting stuff. So you can skim through that or read the posting. I do wish it sort of summarised things a bit more, but again, that's just his style. So yeah, you can have a look at that if you want. So really, that brings me to the end of what I wanted to put in this video. So I hope you're keeping your head above the waters of madness, so to speak. I'll make another video when I've got something new to say. So once again, thanks for your support, thanks for listening, and I wish you very well.